A recoilless rifle. A recoilless gun is a type of lightweight tube artillery that is designed to allow some of the propellant gases to escape out the rear of the weapon at the moment of ignition, creating forward thrust that counteracts some of the weapon's recoil. This allows for the elimination of much of the heavy and bulky recoiling mechanisms of a conventional cannon while still enabling the unit to fire a powerful projectile. Besides this, the lower pressures involved allow thinner-walled and lighter tubes, further lowering the weight of the cannon. Technically, only devices that use a rifled barrel are recoilless rifles, while smoothbore variants are recoilless guns. This distinction is often lost, and both are often called recoilless rifles. Though it is similar in form and appearance to a rocket launcher, it fires modified artillery shells, not rockets. The key difference from rocket launchers is that the projectile of the recoilless rifle has no propulsion of its own. Once out of the rifle, it behaves as a normal artillery shell and does not accelerate further, as a missile or rocket would. Nevertheless, there are also boost-after-launch rocket-propelled projectiles available for modern recoilless rifles. Because some projectile velocity is inevitably lost to the recoil compensation backblast, recoilless rifles tend to fire a fairly heavy explosive shell with less range than traditional cannons, although with a far greater ease of transport, making them popular with paratroop, mountain warfare and special forces units, where portability is of particular concern, as well as with some light infantry and infantry fire support units. Although the greatly diminished recoil allows many smaller and newer versions to be shoulder-fired by individual infantrymen, the majority of recoilless rifles in service are mounted on light tripods and intended to be carried by a small 2 or 3-man crew. The largest versions, such as the British 120mm L4 Mobot and L6 Wombat, retain enough bulk and recoil to be restricted to a firm vehicular mount, such as on a jeep, truck, or armored personnel carrier. Design. The typical recoilless gun functions very much like a conventional gun. The projectile and propellant are supplied as a single round and loaded into the breech. When fired, however, instead of all the propellant blast following the projectile out the barrel, a large portion is allowed to escape to the rear, gaining a rearward directed momentum which is nearly equal to the forward momentum of the projectile. This balance of momentum ensures that the momentum of the rifle projectile exhaust gas system is conserved without imparting much momentum to the rifle itself. Since recoil has been mostly removed, the heavy and complex gun carriage and recoil damping mechanism can be dispensed with. Despite the name, it is rare for the forces to completely balance, and real-world recoilless rifles to recoil noticeably. Recoilless rifles are maintenance-intensive weapons, and if the breech and gas ports are old, damaged, plugged, or poorly maintained, a recoil damping effect can be reduced or lost altogether, leading to dangerously powerful recoil. Conversely, if a projectile becomes lodged in the barrel for any reason, the entire weapon will recoil forward in the manner of a rocket. Unlike a rocket launcher, which fires fin-stabilized rockets from a smoothbore, recoilless rifle rounds resemble conventional artillery shells. They generally have a pre-engraved rifling band to engage the rifled launch tube, spin-stabilizing the projectile, hence the term rifle. The case area of the shell can be perforated to vent the propellant gases, which are then directed to the rear. As the base of the shell disintegrates, since venting hot gases to the rear can be dangerous in confined spaces, some recoilless guns, such as the Armbrust and Matador, use a combination of a countershot, smoothbore barrel, and pistons to avoid both recoil and backblast. The fin-stabilized Armbrust cartridge contains the propellant charge between 2 pistons with the warhead in front of one, facing forward. and an equal countermass of shredded plastic in front of the other piston. On firing, the propellant expands rapidly, pushing the pistons outward. This pushes the projectile forwards towards the target and the countermass backwards, providing the recoilless effect. The shredded plastic countermass is quickly slowed by air resistance and is harmless at a distance more than a few feet from the breech. The pistons jam at the ends of the barrel, trapping the hot propellant gases inside. All this allows safe firing in enclosed spaces. History. The first recoilless gun was developed by Commander Cleland Davis of the U.S. Navy, just prior to World War I. His design, named the Davis gun, connected two guns back-to-back, with the backwards-facing gun loaded with lead balls and grease of the same weight as the shell in the other gun. His idea was used experimentally by the British as an anti-Zeppelin and anti-submarine weapon mounted on a Handley Page 100 bomber and intended to be installed on other aircraft. In the Soviet Union, the development of recoilless weapons, roughly dynamic reaction cannon, began in 1923. In the 1930s, many different types of weapons were built and tested with configurations ranging from 37 mm to 305 mm. Some of the smaller examples were tested in aircraft and saw some limited production and service, but development was abandoned around 1938. The best known of these early recoilless rifles was the model 1935 76mm DRP designed by Leonid Kurchevsky. A small number of these mounted on trucks saw combat in the Winter War. Two were captured by the Finns and tested. One example was given to the Germans in 1940. The first recoilless gun to enter service in Germany was the 7.5 cm light Geschütz 40. A simple 75mm smoothbore recoilless gun developed to give German airborne troops artillery and anti-tank support that could be parachuted into battle. The 75 was found to be so useful during the invasion of Crete that a larger 105mm version was developed on the same basic pattern. Interestingly, both of these weapons were loosely copied by the U.S. Army, reversing the flow of technology that had occurred when the Germans copied the bazooka as their own 88mm caliber Panzerschreck infantry anti-tank rocket system. The U.S. did have a development program, and it is not clear to what extent the design was copied, as there were, in fact, differences. The Japanese had also developed a portable recoilless anti-tank rifle, which they had reserved for defending against the anticipated invasion of the mainland. As it was, however, these weapons remained fairly rare during the war, although the U.S. versions of the 75 started becoming increasingly common in 1945. During World War II, the Swedish company Bofors Carl-Gustaf developed a small 20mm device, the Carl-Gustaf M42. The British expressed their interest in it, but by that point anti-tank rifles were already out of date. In 1947, the US 75mm was acquired as war surplus by the French military and mounted on a Vespa scooter. It was used by French paratroops as a mobile anti-tank and anti-fortification platform and saw service in Algeria and Indochina. By the time of the Korean War, recoilless rifles were found throughout the U.S. forces. The original U.S. recoilless rifles were the 57mm M18 and 75mm M20, followed by a 105mm. The 75mm recoilless rifle required at least 2 men to move it and could throw its shell several thousand yards with precision. Newer models replacing these were the 90mm M67 and 106mm M40. The The Soviets, likewise, adopted recoilless technology in the 1950s, most commonly in 73 mm, 82 mm, and 107 mm calibers. The British, whose efforts were led by Dennis Burney, inventor of the wall-buster Hesh round, also developed recoilless designs. Burney demonstrated the technique with a recoilless 4-gauge shotgun. His Burney gun was developed to fire the wall-buster shell against the Atlantic wall defenses, but was not required in the D-Day landings of 1944. He went on to produce many designs, including a man-portable 3.45 recoilless rifle, the Ordnance RCL 3.45-inch, pushed into experimental service in late 1945. Two Burney guns were designed primarily as anti-tank weapons. One was 3.45 inches in caliber and could be fired off a man's shoulder or from a light tripod. The other was 3.7 inches in caliber and was carried on a light two-wheeled mounting. The Ordnance RCL 3.45 inches Mk 1 inch weighed 75 pounds, was 68.5 inches long, and fired an 11 pounds wall-buster shell to 1,000 yards. No penetration figures were ever made public, but it is fairly certain that it could knock a 10-pound slab off the back of 6 inches of armor plate at any range it could hit. The 3.7 was a larger weapon weighing 222 pounds. It was 112 inches long and fired a 22.2 pounds wall-buster to 2,000 yards. It is estimated that this could have dealt successfully with armor up to 10 inches thick. Post-war work developed and deployed the BAT series of recoilless rifles, culminating in the 120 mm L6 Wombat. This was too large to be transported by infantry and was usually towed by jeep. The weapon was aimed via a spotting rifle, which fired 50 BMG rounds whose trajectory matched that of the main weapon. Tracer rounds were fired first until hits were observed before firing off the main gun. Lightweight SPG-9 73 mm and B-10 82 mm heavy recoilless rifles are still in service in the Russian Army in airborne units and are found quite commonly around the world in the inventories of former Soviet client states, where they are usually used as anti-tank guns. During the 1960s and 1970s, wire-guided missiles began to supplant recoilless rifles in the anti-tank role. The recoilless rifle started to disappear from the military except in areas such as the Arctic, where battery-powered Dragons and wire-guided TOWs would fail due to extremely low temperatures. The former 6th Light Infantry Division in Alaska used the M67 in its special weapons platoons, as did the Ranger battalions and the U.S. Army's Berlin Brigade. The last major use was the M50 on TOS, which mounted 6 of the US 106 mm on a light-tracked chassis first developed for use by the U.S. Army airborne troops in 1950. However, the Army considered them useless, and the Marines adopted the vehicle in a limited role. They used them to great effect as an anti-personnel fire support vehicle during the Vietnam War. The crews continued to report that the ONTOS was a very effective fighting vehicle in this role, but the military brass continued to argue for heavier designs, and in 1970 the ONTOS was removed from service and most were broken up. However, a recoilless rifle found other roles, most notably in the India-Pakistan confrontation in Kashmir, where it was used against bunkers and as artillery in otherwise inhospitable terrain. The Viet Minh also developed their own recoilless rifle under the direction of Tran Dai Gia. The Vietnamese version was named SKZ Sung Kong Gi-80 and was used intensively in assaulting the French bunkers and fortified deployed positions. The larger version of SKZ was DKZ GIAT. Today, one of several remaining frontline recoilless rifles in the armies of industrialized nations is the famous Carl-Gustave recoilless rifle, an 84mm man-portable anti-tank weapon. First introduced in 1946, it is still in widespread use throughout the world today, and has even been reintroduced into the U.S. Marine Corps as an anti-bunker weapon. The 84mm can be used, along with 66mm and LAW-80 for mouseholing whilst fighting in built-up areas. This is where impromptu doors are added to a building to gain entry, hopefully avoiding the prepared defenses of the occupiers. Many nations also use a weapon related to the Carl-Gustave, the one-shot-at-4 recoilless weapon. Another recoilless rifle still in use is the Italian-made 80mm breeder Folgore, which was introduced in 1986 and built up to 2001. It is available in shoulder-launched and tripod-mounted versions. The use of boost after launch, rocket-propelled projectiles gives the weapon a long effective range when compared to similar weapons. The US-made M40 106mm recoilless rifle, usually mounted on a jeep, a similar small vehicle, is very common in the armies of many countries, where it serves as a tank destroyer. Deployed by the United States in the 1960s, the Davy Crockett used a recoilless smoothbore gun to launch a tactical nuclear warhead. Civilian use. Older recoilless rifles are still used by the U.S. National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service as a system for avalanche control. The Washington State Department of Transportation uses a 105mm recoilless rifle for avalanche control on Interstate 90.